Mayor Michael Putrino, and I want to welcome all of our panelists and everyone who is watching on their devices to the Milford second annual Domestic Violence Awareness Symposium. The governing body of New Milford recognizes that domestic violence occurs in communities all over our nation, as well as in our own. We recognize that it occurs far too often, and we recognize that awareness and the conversation about it occurs too seldom. Last year, we hosted this event in recognition of Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and the response was tremendous. So we decided that we needed to do it again. I want to thank Councilman Matt Seymour for all the hard work and energy he put into last year's meaningful event and all the work and energy he put into this year's. And I am confident that this year's event will be just as meaningful. Office of the Mayor Proclamation. Whereas domestic violence is widespread and affects more than 12 million Americans each year, and whereas according to statistics, 24 people per minute in America are victims of rape, stalking, or physical violence by an intimate partner, and whereas this means about 3 in 10 women and 1 in 10 men are victims or survivors of domestic violence, and whereas domestic violence is a serious crime that affects people of all ages, races, genders, and socioeconomic status, and whereas domestic violence costs the nation billions of dollars annually in medical expenses, police and court costs, shelters, foster care, sick leave, absenteeism, and overall non-productivity, and whereas only awareness and coordinated community efforts will shine a light and put a stop to this criminal behavior, and whereas the Borough of New Milford is committed to the safety and security of all of its residents and to prosecute perpetrators of domestic violence, and whereas Domestic Violence Awareness Month provides an excellent opportunity for residents to learn more about preventing domestic violence and to show support for the numerous of organizations and individuals who provide critical advocacy, services, and assistance to victims and survivors. Now therefore I, Mayor Michael Putrino, do hereby proclaim October 2020 as Domestic Violence Awareness Month in New Milford and urge all residents to know the signs, report suspected abuse, and to reject and denounce behavior that mimics, minimizes, or makes fun of domestic violence in real life, movies, internet gaming, or any other circumstances. Thank you.
At this time, I'd like to ask the Bergen County Prosecutor, Mark Masella, to say a few words.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank everybody for being here virtually. I want to thank all the panelists for being here in person and for taking part in tonight's presentation. I want to thank Mayor Putrino, I want to thank Chief Clancy, and I want to thank Councilman Seymour for organizing this event and for inviting me here to say a few words. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And tonight's event is a collaboration and partnering of advocates, agencies, and government officials who are here tonight to help educate each other, to share ideas, to share support, to share resources, and to share ideas in an effort to effectuate change and stop the cycle of domestic violence. So to start the conversation, I have a few numbers to share with you. According to the New England Journal of Medicine, approximately 1 in 4 women and 1 in 10 men will experience some type of abuse in an intimate relationship. And while these numbers are striking, what's more concerning is the effect that COVID-19 has had on our friends, our neighbors, and our loved ones. While national reports indicate that calls to abuse hotlines are down by 50%, and some of the reasons for that will be discussed here tonight, we all know that abuse is still happening at an alarming rate. In fact, during the 7 months of the pandemic in Bergen County, there have been 557 simple assaults and violations of restraining order complaints, which the Bergen County Prosecutor's Office has taken in. There has also been approximately 500 similar complaints signed in municipal courts in Bergen County. In all of 2019, last year, that number was the same. So the takeaway is that in 7 months of the pandemic, we have had the same number of cases that we have had for all of the 12 months of 2019. So what these numbers show is that the work being done by organizations such as the Alternatives for Domestic Violence, the Women's Rights Information Center, Healing Space, and the Center for Hope and Safety is crucial and critical now more than ever. And as everything that we have, as in everything that we are doing with COVID-19, we must be creative, we must be persistent, and we must be of service to our communities. So I want to thank you for inviting me here tonight, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you, Prosecutor. This time I would ask Bergen County Sheriff Anthony Cureton to say a few words.
Good evening. It's an honor to be able to stand before everyone here to have this discussion about something that doesn't discriminate but touches everyone at some point in their lives. We never look forward to it, but however, we encounter situations where we have family members, friends who experience domestic violence. I think the major challenge is having that discussion about domestic violence. I've seen in my law enforcement career several situations where I've come to people's residence as a patrol officer, had conversation with them, and the hardest part was trying to get to them and say, open up, let me know what happened, and what can we do to prevent it? And that was the most challenging part. Later in my career, when I worked in the correctional institution, I sat across the table and spoke to individuals who committed the act of domestic violence and trying to understand what was their motivation for it. I concluded that the motivation was no one ever talked about it. And since no one ever talked about it, it seemed in their mind to be an accepted practice. So the organizations like Hope and Safety, Alternative Domestic Violence, and all those who are with us, as well as with the prosecutor offers, is needed. We need to celebrate those who are victims of domestic violence and celebrate them in a way that we tell their stories so we won't have the continued domestic violence. It's all about opening up. It's all about embracing and having the discussion. That should be the moment we're celebrating, trying to reach out and have the discussion and let everybody know about the programming that is available to offer some type of assistance. In doing research, you hear about domestic violence of the disabled. You hear about domestic violence, especially in this COVID time, as the prosecutor had said. The problem we're having is it's not being communicated. It's not being told. And we have to charge each other or take the responsibility amongst each other to make sure to solicit the folks what is going on, or again, there are people you can talk to. The Bergen County Sheriff's Office is here to provide any support that we can offer, and Mr. Seymour, Councilman Seymour, has been more, as you can see, a major advocate for prevention of domestic violence, in which I thank him for picking up the phone and calling and asking for any advice, suggestion, or any of my resources to help combat domestic violence. So again, I want to thank everybody for coming out, for allowing me to come and stand before you and talk about domestic violence. It's near and dear to me. In the course of my life, I've had family members who unfortunately were subjected to domestic violence. And in those early years, I've witnessed it and myself couldn't say anything about it because I really didn't understand it. I thought it was a cultural thing. And that was in my early years. But as I've learned over the time, it's easy, or I wouldn't say it's easy. We have to get the youth to get that information out just the same, to push our adults and all to come out and talk about it, explain it, not let it think to be a crime that you can't speak about domestic violence in your home. So again, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to stand before you, and the Bergen County Sheriff is here to combat domestic violence.
Thank you, Sheriff. Before shifting gears for a moment, I want to take an opportunity to thank the law enforcement community, not only in New Milford, but in Bergen County. We're quite fortunate to have some of the hardest working public servants in the state of New Jersey working to keep our families safe. So I thank the Bergen County Prosecutor's Office, I thank the Bergen County Sheriff's Department, and I thank the New Milford Police for their hard work and service to our community and their passion and dedication towards the community outreach programs such as these, which wouldn't be possible without them. So thank you. I'd like to welcome the Chairwoman of the Board of Chosen Freeholders in Bergen County, Commissioner Mary Amoroso, to say a few words.
I worked my way down the socially distanced line. And again, we have the most remarkable resources in Bergen County, including our law enforcement and Center for Hope and Safety Alternatives to Domestic Violence, Women's Rights Information Center, so many good resources. And tonight's conference is all about making those resources known to our constituents. We meet here in virtual solidarity. Those of us in the domestic violence helping community know that there has been a concerning drop in calls to helplines. People are in close quarters with their abusers, and they cannot break away long enough to make a call and report physical and emotional abuse, controlling behavior, manipulation, gaslighting. What we are doing here tonight is to help people define and be able to identify signs of intimate partner violence. It's just so important that families are aware, as I've said, of the resources in Bergen County. We are pleased that we can be part of this second Domestic Violence Symposium in New Milford. We thank the whole town of New Milford, the police chief, our friend Councilman Matt Seymour, and Councilwoman Lisa Sandhusen. These struggles can seem so personal and really too shameful to talk about, but that's what we are here to do, to start to talk about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. So what led to us deciding to hold a second event this year was the fact that we got a call that incidents in domestic violence increased during this time period. More specifically, that with people feeling trapped and isolated at home with nowhere to go, in many instances, victims of domestic violence felt pressured to stay with their abusers. In some instances, they returned back to a home with an abuser or welcomed an offender back to the house. And on other occasions, victims expressed a concern of fear and trepidation to go to a shelter for fear of catching COVID-19 in a shelter. So this time period, while it's certainly been challenging for all of us across the board and affected all of our lives dramatically in very significant and unfortunately in tragic ways, has also impacted this field of domestic violence. So to begin, I'm going to ask retired New Jersey Superior Court Judge Ronny Siegal for her perspective on how the courts are handling these cases during this difficult time, and how, as a judge, when she sat on the bench and heard domestic violence cases herself, she preferred cases to be presented. Judge.
Thank you, Matt. Life with COVID, that's our new normal. It's totally affected our court system, and more particularly, how a victim of domestic violence can secure a temporary restraining order, a permanent restraining order. How do we navigate the legal system today? So from March through the beginning of September, our county courthouse was closed. A victim would file for a temporary restraining order at the police department, and they were open 24 hours a day to serve that community. In the past, a victim could go to the courthouse during the working hours, secure a temporary restraining order, or after hours could go to the police department. The new normal now, something very special has happened. In September, the courthouse was open. But right now, a victim of domestic violence can call the courthouse. Just going to share with you the number because I want you to know how available it is. The general number is 201-221-0700. The domestic violence unit is extension 25185. All you have to do as a victim of domestic violence is call. A domestic violence counselor will speak with you. They will prepare your complaint. Once that's filed, you'll be sworn and speak with a hearing officer or a judge. And at that point in time, that is one way that you can get a temporary restraining order. It's important for every victim to understand that service of the restraining order is not done by them, that it's the police who receive electronically a copy of the temporary restraining order that has the burden and responsibility of serving that order upon the defender. So, step number one, you can actually just telephone the domestic violence unit. In addition, some people still go to the courthouse. Well, you can do that. At the Court Street entrance where the Sheriff's Department is located, a party is escorted to a separate waiting room for victims of domestic violence. There, they provide the same information. It's taken down by a domestic violence counselor, and again, either a hearing officer or a judge will swear them in. They can issue the temporary restraining order at that point in time. Again, I must underscore, nobody is ever turned away if they're seeking to file for a restraining order. So too, there are times that people do want to go to the municipality, to the police department, and again, they can do that. And I want the police to understand, if they're listening here today, they can stay there and just telephone on behalf of the victim. They can telephone the domestic violence unit, who is more than happy and is encouraging of taking down that complaint, the information, preparing the complaint for the victim. No one is turned away. Note that some victims are reluctant to go to the police department, so calling on the phone or appearing at the courthouse sometimes make a victim more comfortable. I think one of the issues with victims of domestic violence is, while they want to be safe, they're unsure about the emotional and economic well-being when they take this important step. When you ask for relief in a temporary restraining order, don't forget you can seek rent, child support, pendente lite support, use of a car, payment of your bills, parenting time, no parenting time. So there are a few things that you can ask for that will get you through that final restraining order hearing. Now, what happens at a hearing, again, our courts were closed. So from about a month, we did not have the ability to assure people that they could have a final restraining order hearing. That's not the case now. Now we do have our hearings, and we do it by this method called Zoom. And for the most part, most people understand what that is and can navigate the system. I want you to understand, I recognize, and the courts recognize, that not everybody can do that. But the domestic violence unit and the courts will ensure that there will be some way that a trial can be held so that everybody can proceed and a victim can get their day in court to secure a final restraining order. There's an issue of evidence, and one wonders how one gets evidence. When you are securing and having the hearing for a final restraining order, you're given an email address, or an address, I should say, for the clerk of the court. You send your evidence to the clerk of the law clerk, of the judge, and at the time of trial, if you're in any way unsure how to present your evidence, the judge already has it for you and can assist you at that point in time. Sometimes, actually, there are parties that wish to amend their restraining order. That can be done. Sometimes there are parties that wish to dismiss their restraining order. That too is done by Zoom. The only thing you have to remember is to have identification with you so that they can be assured that if that is your choice, if you're making a voluntary and knowing decision to withdraw your restraining order, that you're the person who actually has had it filed. We've learned that at the outset of the pandemic, there was a lull in the reporting of domestic violence incidents. And with the lockdown, courts also found that times were even more dangerous for victims. Today, we've ascertained that the number of reported complaints of domestic violence are going up in our court system. By being able to go directly to the domestic violence unit by a telephone without the necessity of doing anything further to secure a temporary restraining order, we're on the road to helping victims of domestic violence. If you secure that final restraining order, you may wonder, how do I obtain financial relief, a rent? Where do I stay? I want you to know in that regard that those are the kinds of requests for relief that a judge can help you with. So if you're asking, well, where would I live? Where do I secure support? What happens to my children if I don't want the abuser to see them? Or if I do want the abuser to see them, but under some supervision? What about the cost of an attorney? What about property damage? What about compensation for the medical injuries I've sustained? What about an evaluation from my abuser? What about a mental evaluation, a substance abuse evaluation? How about an evaluation to assist them so there is no further abuse? You have the right to seek that relief for support, for rent, for medical services, for parenting time, for all these evaluations. The new normal is different, but I want to secure that in my life experience, the police, the domestic violence unit and their counselors, and our court systems and our judges are here for you.
Judge, thank you. This question is for Katheryn Miller, who's a senior attorney at the Center for Hope and Safety. Ms. Miller, in your experience during this COVID era, what services has your center provided, and how has your center tailored those services to the unique challenges during this difficult time?
Thank you, Matt. Like the judge mentioned, at first, during this time of COVID, we also at the Center for Hope and Safety noticed that we were getting much fewer calls, which is very disturbing because we run the hotline that provides emergency shelter services. So many victims were choosing to stay at home rather than seeking unknown shelter. However, since then, we've seen a great increase. What we are offering our full array of services during this COVID time. We have our emergency safe house, which, despite being in Bergen County, we have not had a single case of COVID. If you call our hotline seeking services, we have special ways of quarantining you and your family so that people are safe, and we are taking every single precaution to make sure that you're not exposed to COVID. When you go to our safe house, we have our children's program there where we can offer children art therapy. If you have pets, we work with Shelter Our Pets so that we can find a safe place for your pets so that you don't have to worry about leaving your pets with an abuser. We have our legal program, which I'm one of the attorneys at the legal program, so we can offer you free legal services in a restraining order or a custody order or some divorce cases, and we also offer legal help in immigration cases. We are currently operating our outreach program, where if you want to stay in your community, we can also offer you case management and other assistance through that, in bilingual services as well. We have our Project Child, which provides intensive therapeutic treatment for children, and we continue to offer that both virtually during this time. And we also work with our sister agencies to make sure that we provide a very well-rounded experience. So we'll refer to alternatives to domestic violence for counseling or women's rights center or healing space so that we can offer a comprehensive services. during this COVID time, we're still open and we're still trying to serve you. At first it was very difficult. I think for everybody it was difficult. You know, nobody wants to leave your home where you're safe and go to an unknown place. But there are still options for you, and you do not have to stay in these relationships, and we are here to help. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Miller, and thank you for the work that Hope and Safety is doing in this county and the services that your shelter is providing. Commissioner Ortiz, in your experience, what impact do cultural differences have on domestic violence?
Thank you, Matt. I'm glad you asked me that question because I've been getting a lot of phone calls in regards to this. And what I feel overall is that learning to understand the culture is the most important thing to me in regards to each individual person or the household that they live in. I myself, I'm a Latina, and domestic violence is prevalent in immigrant communities due to culture in Latino communities, what we call machismo, where in order to be perceived as a man, you have to be aggressive and you have to be assertive. This contributes to the whole culture of domestic violence. I think most of the machismo men think of their significant others as basically just a property. And the way they go about doing this is they try to control them either through finances or not let them have a career or a job to hold down, so that way they could have more control over their finances. And I think it's also an emotional and physical abuse in that way because it becomes also a generational culture. That's why it's so important us as individuals to educate our children. I myself have 2 daughters, and I'm constantly letting her know this is not all right. I know you might see it, and you might have people around. It might not even be just a Latino situation, because we're seeing it a lot amongst our young teenagers, because it does start at an early age. But if we educate our daughters and our sons on the changes of this culture, I think we could be in a much better place. I received multiple calls since I'm the only Latina as a commissioner. And I received a call just 2 days ago of an individual who called me crying that she got beat up. And the reason for the whole argument was because she opened a checking account without letting him know. And maybe that's, losing control or so on. But unfortunately, he beat her up. I gave her the number to domestic violence. He tries to hold her down, unfortunately, because she's undocumented. So he refers to her as the illegal, the spick, all horrible, horrible names. And I sent her to Alternatives to Domestic Violence, because we are one of the few counties in the state of New Jersey that offer these services to the individuals. And she called me so happy today, and she's like, I'm so thankful. They're actually going to go with me to court on Monday, which I'm very happy for her. And she's getting counseling and she's getting help, and also our partnerships, which are great. We just hope from the Center for Hope and Safety and the Women's Right the Center for Women's Rights Information. I mean, these are great partnerships that we have with the county, as well with the Sheriff's Department and the Prosecutor's Office. So as we all work together, I think we can get in a better place. And I think it's also a better understanding of, especially with Alternatives to Domestic Violence, because our counseling is both in Spanish and in Korean, which are the most dominant other languages that are spoken throughout the county, because we're a very diverse county. So having that understanding and having, I think, of that, I guess, culture understanding makes a big difference on maybe making an impact on a lot of families and to a lot of women moving forward. So I'm glad that we observe, as a county, we're on top of this. We understand it, and I wish we could speak all languages, but just to be understanding of it, because we're all so different.
Thank you, Commissioner. With that being said, Commissioner, since you did mention Bergen County's Alternatives to Domestic Violence, which is one of the only county agencies in the state of New Jersey that provides services at the county level to survivors, Mr. Cohen has a challenging role in that he attempts diligently to help families suffering from domestic violence by offering unique treatment programs to offenders who want help. Mr. David Cohen, would you please describe the services not only that your agency provides, but in particular that you provide to offenders?
We utilize what is called the Duluth model, which is an evidence-based program, and we have perpetrators in our groups from every walk of life that you can imagine. Any type of person that lives in Bergen County, he is represented in the groups. And it's very important to understand also, whereas the vast majority of perpetrators statistically would certainly be men and victims women, there are women who are abusers, men who are victims, and we do have, one of our groups is for women who are the primary abuser in the relationship. One of our batters intervention groups is in Spanish language, so we can accommodate folks from the Latino community. And this work of prevention goes beyond just working with adults. In addition to our batters intervention program, we have a very extensive community outreach program, which includes educating youth, and more specifically, and something I'm very involved with, is working with young men and boys from middle school through high school. Again, providing information about alternatives to the toxic masculinity culture that we all grow up in. And this is, just crucially important. And certainly most of the perpetrators that we counsel are mandated to our groups. We are very open to any male or female abuser in the community who themselves voluntarily wants to seek treatment and seek education. So you don't necessarily have to be mandated. We do take voluntary clients. So this, again, is a very, very important part of what we do. And Bergen County has really allowed us to grow this program over several decades already. And it's been really, I think, a very, very effective program.
Thank you, David. I'd like to ask Susan Dejackmo, your counterpart at Alternatives to Domestic Violence. Ms. Dejackmo, how have you seen cases go up during this COVID time? And what services does ADV provide, not only generally to survivors of domestic violence, but more specifically during this pandemic?
Over the past month, cases have been increasing. Right now, we're providing all our services telephonically, and they will be going virtual. We provide court preparation sessions, and that educates an individual on what will happen during a hearing. Victims are screened for pro bono representation, and we do provide pro bono representation. Our dispatchers are working with the police when victims come in to speak to them over the phone, and we're there. Our counseling program for victims are being done in group and individuals. Again, telephonically, it will go virtual. Our counselors are licensed counselors, and they are trained in EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, which is very important for those who suffer trauma, and most victims do suffer trauma. We have the 24-hour hotline, and we also are running a housing program for relocation. There's several different grants that right now we have, especially when the rent requirements come at the for your rent payments at the end of the year will be due. We're working with landlords. So we were very fortunate to get that grant. We're working with Center for Hope and Safety with that, Legal Services, Women's Rights, Bergen Family Center, as well as Healing Space. That's what we've seen right now is a challenge for victims is safety planning. It's more difficult to leave. It's harder to seek services safely, and housing has been a major barrier. Being laid off, we have victims who their work schedules have been reduced, and it just has caused much more stressors, not only on the victims, but also on their children. So we've been working, our clinical unit has been working very diligently with the victims.
Thank you, Susan. This question is for Assistant Prosecutor Jessica Gomperts, who is the chief of the Bergen County Prosecutor's Office Domestic Violence Unit. Ms. Gomperts, how has your office been handling the prosecution of domestic violence cases in light of this recent pandemic and quarantine?
Thank you, Matt. We, like everybody else, shut down in mid-March, and while the courthouse closed physically and the prosecutor's office physically closed, we were open for business the entire time. The police departments had not stopped their efforts in taking reports and responding to 911 calls, and the cases never stopped coming into the prosecutor's office, although it just looked a little bit differently. We were working from home and we were Zooming with the court. Our victim advocacy office was still making phone calls to the victims. The cases were still being screened into the office. Defendants were still being seen, lodged in the jail, seen at first appearance court, and the court processes continued even though the physical buildings were shut. The services that we were providing, along with the police, never stopped, and victims were still able to obtain temporary restraining orders. They were still able to obtain no contact orders as conditions of defendants' release from the jail. And despite all of the various challenges with sort of the machinery of it all, the cases continued to flow mostly uninterrupted the entire time.
Prosecutor. Just to shift the focus for a moment from prosecution and services to a survivor's perspective, we're joined once again this year by a former Assemblywoman, by a survivor of domestic violence herself, who was also a statewide advocate for victims and survivors, Ms. Maria Rodriguez-Gregg. Ms. Gregg, as a survivor, I should say, would you please talk to access to the resources necessary to get the help that is needed?
Thank you. So specifically access, obviously we keep talking about the pandemic, COVID, and the difficulty in obtaining resources. When you're quarantined with your abuser, there's an intimidation factor. I mean, for me, when I was just pursuing the charges of simple assault, I remember, and I spoke with you about this last year, being in a municipal court, which was essentially traffic court, in full view of the person that abused me and that assaulted me. And it's very intimidating. So imagine being quarantined with your abuser. I have, since that time, and being an advocate, came to the board of an organization called Forever Your Overwatch Foundation. And what they do is they specifically provide security and safety services for those that are experiencing intimate partner violence. So, for those people that are wanting to find resources that, maybe they understand that there's access possibly to financial resources, to counseling, they still may not feel safe in getting that. They may feel that there is the element of retribution, that getting services, getting a restraining order may escalate violence, and that's something we see all the time. And so when a police officer, anybody, asks somebody, why would you leave? Because there's a very real fear for your life and for your children's life and safety. Our foundation, at no cost to the person experiencing violence, will go into your home or wherever you have been placed. If you have escaped and gone to another home, you're staying with someone else, we will secure the home. We will put alarms in the windows. We will put cameras. We will go to court with you. We will escort you and do whatever we can to ensure that you are safe and that you are able to not just immediately get away from a violent, emotionally, financially abusive situation, but also stay out of that situation. We also make it a point to partner with different organizations, have a network, so that we can direct you to access towards getting the financial resources needed, towards getting safety and support. This is something that they talk about here very much. They've already said how they partner together. They're aware of what services are out there, so that if they can't provide that service, they're going to find someone that does. Especially now with, as they've been talking with courts. Right now with courts and COVID, many of this stuff is via Zoom. Who is to say that there still isn't an intimidation factor there? That abuser could still somehow make their way into that person's home, and that is something that we have experienced, and it is something that is happening. Our foundation will assist in those situations, so again, you are safe and secure. I know my experience was outside this pandemic. While it was very difficult and emotionally traumatizing to be in that situation, to get out of that situation, and it was intimidating for me, I can't imagine the element of intimidation and fear that people feel right now in the quarantine situation. But we are doing everything that we can to provide safety and support and access to resources to get you out of violent and abusive situations.
Thank you. We're also joined again this year by Sergeant George Herrero of the New Milford Police Department, who, like everybody in the law enforcement community, I'm sure has been beyond challenged and perhaps even overwhelmed by the calls received during this difficult time. Sergeant, how has the New Milford Police responded to calls of domestic violence, not only specifically during this current time period, but in addition, how does the department handle a call when the alleged offender is also a member of law enforcement?
Well, the servicing of calls has never changed, pre or post pandemic. The second part of your question is an interesting topic to cover, because somebody who would have been or could have been or is being abused by someone in law enforcement, they may find themselves scared, more scared than somebody who's being abused by an average citizen. And as a law enforcement officer, my career goes back 22 years. And when people ask me, what happens to a police officer when they break the law? I said, well, we're not above the law. We have to uphold and we have to follow the laws. So if someone finds themselves to be abused by somebody in law enforcement, then they should follow every chain as if they were being victimized by someone who's not in law enforcement. There are Attorney General guidelines out there that law enforcement officers have to follow. Departments have to follow these guidelines. So if you go to your local police department, if you live in any town USA, and you tell them what's happening, that department is bound to investigate that. That officer at that point, okay, needs to be investigated. I've been to many a domestic violence update classes with one of our presenters up here. And she has been very proud in saying that in Bergen County, there are no law enforcement officers that have final restraining orders on them. Okay, so if you find yourself in a relationship with a law enforcement officer and you find yourself to be a victim of domestic violence, there's no reason you shouldn't feel 100% safe and sure that when you walk into that person's police department, when you walk into your local police department, when you walk into any police department, that complaint there will be handled 100%. Nobody's going to be turned away. Nothing's going to be poo-pooed. Okay, this person is not above the law and they're not going to get away with it. And the victim needs to understand that.
An application for a final restraining order in New Jersey is based upon several what we call predicate acts. Predicate acts are the alleged basis for a final restraining order. One of those predicate acts is sexual assault. We are joined today by Simaza Sadek of Healing Faith, the YWCA of Northern New Jersey. Ms. Sadek, would you please speak to the issue as to when and how sexual violence is a part of domestic violence?
Thank you, Matt. There is this powerful myth about rape and sexual assault that dominates our thinking and perceptions of what real rape is and what it's considered. This popular misconception was that rape was perpetrated exclusively by strangers. So this concept of stranger danger, the lurking male-presenting person in the bushes that jumps out and attacks unsuspecting female-presenting people. So what this thinking does, it does not allow for a discussion or recognition of sexual violence that occurs between two people who know each other, and it doesn't acknowledge that people from various gender identities can both perpetrate and be victimized by sexual violence. What we know now is that sexual assault, more often than not, occurs among people who know each other, and usually in a place that is the survivor is familiar with, that feels safe to them, like their home. So in a relationship, sexual violence is rarely an isolated incident. It often occurs alongside other forms of abusive behaviors, including physical, emotional, mental abuse. And intimate partner sexual violence often starts with controlling behaviors that can escalate to further emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. What we know is that sexual violence and the intersection of sexual violence and domestic violence is a crime that really hinders one's ability to access the full spectrum of their human rights. And the majority of those who are physically assaulted by an intimate partner have also been sexually assaulted by that same partner. And the survivors know the perpetrator and oftentimes blame themselves for their assault. And what happens oftentimes is they struggle to define it as that, which is an assault.
Thank you, Ms. Sadek. I would also just like to point out that Ms. Sadek's agency is the only agency dedicated to sexual violence in the county. And it is much like to thank them for their unique and very important service to survivors and victims. There's also sometimes confusion, understandably so, to understand the different remedies available for a survivor when there's a concurrent civil case and a criminal case. So I would like to ask Ms. Carol Weissman of Northeast New Jersey Legal Services to explain the differences between Nicole's Law, SASPA, which is short for the Sexual Assault Survivors Act, and of course, a family part restraining order.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. We've been talking tonight about domestic violence, which has a victim in particular relationships, household members, dating relationships, partners, individuals that are married, that have children in common together. There needs to be the definition of that victim to be able to get a temporary restraining order under what we've been talking as domestic violence here tonight. In addition to that, there was in 2015, because there was a gap in the law that just did not address the sexual violence and sexual assault that could happen between, say, a neighbor and a neighbor, an employer and an employee. The initial focus of it was really for college students who went to parties and were sexually assaulted for that one night stand, and there was no place for them. As a result of that, SASPA was passed, the Sexual Assault Survivors Protection Act, which allows those individuals that I just spoke about to be able to get a final order as well. So we've now been able to bridge that gap, and the process is similar as Judge Siegal had outlined. You can either call the domestic violence unit in Bergen County, or you actually the procedure is to just call the domestic violence unit. The police officers are not taking those complaints yet. We're working on that going forward, but what's important to know under SASPA and what has halted some people from filing going forward is there is no need that a police report be filed for the sexual assault allegations to get a final restraining order, and similarly under the Prevention Against Domestic Violence Act. There's another part of the criminal law which allows for an automatic imposition of a no-contact order that is issued through the prosecutor's office, but that is upon conviction. A little different situation because that will depend upon the actual defendant being convicted. At the beginning, when Nicole's Act was started, it allowed for pre-bail, pre-conviction as well, but since we've had some bail reform, that's not as prevalent these days. So the point is, at this point, wherever you see yourself, there are options to go and get a final order against the abuser, against the sexual assault perpetrator. For everybody's knowledge, we're legal services. We are a legal services organization. We represent individuals who cannot afford to have legal services in not only the domestic violence and sexual assault cases, but if there's a need for housing, immigration, consumer debt, tax issues, we can bridge that legal gap. And I leave you with my final advertisement, which is, you know, if you were a brain surgeon, you wouldn't do brain surgery on yourself. And a lot of times people think, oh, my case is so obvious, the judge has to grant my restraining order. Not so much the case in the sense that these orders are permanent in New Jersey, unlike some other states where they have to be renewable. So I would advise anyone who's obtained the order, contact our offices, contact ADV, CHS. We all work as partner agencies, and please get representation if you're going into court. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Wiseman. Speaking of legislation, we're joined this year for the first time as a panelist, the second time she has graciously joined our symposium, by District 38 Assemblywoman Lisa Swain. Assemblywoman, what changes in the law would you like to see implemented in the state of New Jersey to protect domestic violence survivors?
I just wanted to tell a little story about how important events like this are. Because, you know, thank you to the people who are watching now. There may be opportunities for people to find out how to get help. And over the weekend, the Center for Hope and Safety had a walk, and I attended, and I posted some pictures on my Facebook page. And as a result, someone contacted me wanting to know how to find out more information. And, you know, I was grateful for that because, you know, now at least one other person we know may be getting the help that they need that they couldn't have gotten before. So on the legislative side, there are a couple of things that we've done that I think will hopefully make a difference. I'm the vice chair of the Women and Children Committee in the Assembly, and recently we passed a resolution that is going to form a 16-member task force to study domestic violence at home, in school, at work, And it's really going to specifically look at the unmet legal needs of New Jersey domestic violence cases, because this is so critical, because nobody should be in an abusive relationship, and they shouldn't be stopped from getting out of that relationship just because they're unable to obtain legal representation. So that's one thing going forward. And the other thing that I wanted to mention tonight is that I have a bill that would require health insurers to categorize mental health treatment and therapy received by victims of domestic violence as a medical necessity, so that they would get coverage for therapy and other mental health treatments. We all know that we can see the evidence of domestic violence, and a person can go to the hospital and get treated for that, but we don't always see the scars, obviously, that are on the inside, and those are the scars that need to be treated as well. So hopefully, moving forward, getting cooperation from insurance companies to be a partner with us so that people can get treated on the inside as well as the outside, and then the task force coming together to really look at ways that people can get the legal representation that they need to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Assemblywoman. Beyond simply affecting the direct victim and survivor of domestic violence affects an entire family. It affects an entire household, which means that tragically it also has an impact on children. Again this year, by Christa Madler at the New Jersey Division of Child Protection and Permanency. So Ms. Madler, could you please speak to the impact that domestic violence has on children?
Thank you, Councilman Seymour. Certainly, as you indicated, domestic violence doesn't just impact the victim directly, it certainly impacts the children living within the household. So we at the Division of Child Protection and Permanency receive many calls to our hotline with concerns for children who are living in a home where there is active domestic violence. Some of the things we see are similar to what you would see in post-traumatic stress disorder, because experiencing ongoing violence in your home is a trauma. So in children, we often see significant social issues where they have difficulty in relationships with peers, sibling relationships, emotional issues. So you will see anxiety, and that anxiety may manifest in something like school phobia. They don't want to leave the home. They are afraid to leave the victim in the home alone, so they don't want to go to school. Depression, a lot of issues in school. When there's domestic violence going on in the home, often that home is a chaotic environment. And so the structure of the home is not necessarily conducive for that child. So when they go to school, their homework might not be prepared. They're tired, they're hungry, and they're not going to be performing at their best. So sometimes if school personnel or people in the lives of these children aren't aware of what's happening, these children are getting IEPs and labels and diagnoses that probably should be post-traumatic stress disorder. So we look for these effects on children, and we ultimately try to service, the whole family. Our goal is always to try to keep a family, keep children with their parents, or, just maybe perhaps one parent. If the batterer is able to leave the home, we would like to keep the children with their parent, the other parent, the non-offending parent. So our goal is to service, if we can keep the victim safe, we can often keep the children safe in their care. And there's a whole host of services, as you've heard about this evening, that are available to victims and also to children. The Center for Hope and Safety has Project Child, which is a creative arts therapy program for children who are survivors of domestic violence.
Thank you, Ms. Madler. I have a follow-up question for you that I'm going to direct to you, but I'm also going to ask Assistant Prosecutor Gomperts and Sergeant Herrero to please offer your insight as well. In an instance of domestic violence involving, in particular, young children, please speak to when and who would need to contact your agency to request that there be an inquiry and investigation. Would the survivor need to call you separately? Would the police make the call upon the arrest of the offender? Or would the prosecutor's office, or perhaps even the court, Judge Siegal, make the call to the division?
So any of those individuals, or anyone who's aware of a child who's experiencing any type of maltreatment, actually in New Jersey is a mandated reporter. Every citizen is a mandated reporter who has knowledge of a child being maltreated, who has knowledge of a child who's a victim of abuse or neglect. Most often our calls do come from police who respond. They're they get the 911 call, they go to the home. There's children who are present for that incident. They call us. Schools, often children, go to school and tell their teacher, tell a counselor at school. We get reports from school. The family goes in for a custody hearing, a restraining order hearing before the court, and the judge receives information. They often will make the calls to us as well. So any of those individuals are welcome to call us. Victims themselves will sometimes call us. We get calls from probably every person on the stage has called our hotline because we know that domestic violence doesn't just impact the victim. Although many agencies may only work with that victim, they see how it impacts the children as well, and they outreach to us to conduct an investigation and an assessment to see how we can assist.
Thank you, Ms. Madler. Sergeant Herrero?
There's nothing I could add that she didn't cover. Very well said.
So if you respond to a call and there's no sign of injury to a child, and there's no direct evidence the child witnessed the act of domestic violence, do the police contact DCC&P, or do you leave it to the discretion of the courts and the prosecutor's office?
That's going to be a case-by-case situation as to what we see, okay, and when we put our heads together, where we go with it, whether or not we are going to call them, or whether we're not going to call them. Every time there's a child involved in a domestic violence act, doesn't mean that we're going to call. I always call you Dyfus, I'm sorry. DCP&P. So, but it's going to be a case-by-case determination.
Judge.
I just want to underscore to every victim that children, however small they are, infants, are very much aware of domestic violence, and they react and are affected by it. Even if one thinks that it happened in the other room, so to speak, it doesn't. Children hear what's going on. They are traumatized by what's going on. So please remember that. They're right in the middle of it. They're in the line of fire.
Assistant Prosecutor Gomperts.
So to echo what the sergeant said, obviously if the child is involved in the incident, if the mother was holding the child, if the child tried to intervene and was either injured or pushed away by the offender, if the child was involved in the incident, that's a call to DCP&P. If the child witnesses the incident, that's a call to DCP&P. But when we train law enforcement, we strongly encourage law enforcement to make
a call to DCP&P and at least tell the screener the situation in the cases where it might not be so obvious to call. Because I have had hundreds of cases over the years where the report from the victim has been, yes, I have children, but they're upstairs asleep. And the officers go upstairs and the children are not in fact asleep. They're huddled on the stairs listening or looking, or they are in their room, but they're not asleep. And like Judge Siegal just said, children hear and they witness, but I also strongly encourage law enforcement when I do my training to call DCP&P if there's a child living in a home where there is violence, and especially systemic violence. If it's a home where law enforcement has been multiple times, a call to DCP&P to see what's really going on in that house and the environment that that child, in which that child is living, is really always the better course of valor. It's better to be safe than sorry.
Thank you, Prosecutor. One of the strongest advocates not only in Bergen County, but in New Jersey, for victims and survivors is Lil Corcoran of the Women's Information Rights Center, which offers fantastic services not only to survivors but to families. Ms. Corcoran, would you speak to the services that your center provides, and more specifically, as is the theme today, how those services have been tailored in light of COVID-19?
Thanks for having me, and I'm kind of, sitting here. I love your introduction of me because I'm not going to just answer that question because I've been paying attention to what everybody else said.
Of course.
I want to say this: if you're a victim or a survivor, I'm going to tell you how to get in touch with us. I totally agree with you, Assistant Prosecutor, and I adore you. And I'm going to say that it's better to be safe than sorry. And I'm also going to tell you the research is very clear that if you're a mom and you're a victim, you are not reaching out for help because you're afraid that Child Protective Services are getting called. So I don't want people to think that that's an automatic. And certainly if you call us, we're going to do a lot of advocacy for you. And I also want you to know, I think calling DCP&P can be helpful to you, but I don't think it should be, I don't want victims out there listening to this today to think that if you reach out for help that you're going to lose your kids. And that's not what DIFAS is about anyway. However, we will help you through that process. And it's not, for us anyway, it's not an automatic call because we follow the research and we know that that's keeping people in a dangerous situation. So that's one thought I had. The other thing I want to encourage moms and dads to do is to really look at the ACEs work, the Adverse Childhood Experiences work that was done that shows the impact on children that grow up in homes where there's whatever the dysfunction is, whether it's alcoholism, drug addiction, the loss of a parent. When you look at what happens to those kids who grow up and become adults like us, it's sobering, right? So once you become aware of those things as a parent, if you love your kids, and I'm sure you do, you're going to start to want to take the steps that's necessary to help them. And I feel really fortunate that as a Bergen County resident, I used to work for Center for Hope and Safety. I was very instrumental in getting the Project Child started in this county. It's a huge, wonderful program. The only problem with it, there's not enough space to get more kids into it. Those are awesome therapists that can help you with your kids. I also was lucky. This basically, what this means is I'm just old, right? I was also lucky enough to be very instrumental in starting the Domestic Violence Liaison Program in Bergen County, which is about having domestic violence liaisons stationed in the DCP&P office to help victims sort of be a liaison with their case managers at DIFAS or DCP&P. So those are my first two go-tos when I deal with families. DCP&P domestic violence liaisons. If you don't remember this, it's okay, because you can call us and I will remind you. And the other is Project Child at Center for Hope and Safety. Those are two huge resources in Bergen County. Now I'm going to tell you about the resource that we have to offer. Women's Rights Information Center has been around for 47 years. If you just think about it, that was started in the early 70s. The Women's Center was started in the early 70s, and the issues that we were dealing with, and I'm not that old, I was just a kid, so I didn't start that agency. But of course we were dealing with abuse. Women were coming in with sexual assault survivors, trauma survivors, poverty, being left by husbands at the time when, listen, back then women couldn't even have a credit card in their own name. So that's when the agency was founded. In the past year, we sort of, we realized that we were always serving victims, but it became a little bit more institutionalized because we received a grant from the Department of Justice, the New Jersey Attorney General's office. So we are working specifically with victims of all kinds of crime, not just domestic violence, although the vast majority are domestic violence. I mean, we've had women that were shot in the foot randomly walking down the street. I mean, so if you're a victim of crime and you need help, call us. If we can't help you, we're going to try to find the help for you. And that's what we've been charged with doing. And we would do it whether we had the money to do it or not, because that's what our personal mission is. I also want to say to survivors and victims, and even using those words and trauma and abuse and all these words that we've been using today, chances are you're watching this and you're like, well, I'm not really a victim. I really wasn't abused. I'm not traumatized. So those are really words that all of us are very familiar with, but most folks that are suffering through it are not. Those are not labels that you're willing to take on or have been willing to take on. Maybe you have, either way. But I want to say that when I worked at a battered women's shelter, I would have women come to the shelter. Obviously, they're in a battered women's shelter and tell me that they weren't abused because it wasn't as bad as the next woman. So I'm encouraging if you're watching this to remember that abuse doesn't mean that you had to have your head handed to you. There's a whole litany of things that goes on with that, and we can help you with that. If you're not sure, call us, and we will kind of go through it with you. We have safety plans that we do whether you're staying in the relationship or leaving the relationship in 8 or 10 different languages. 40% of our staff speak Spanish, so Spanish is not a problem. We have a domestic violence advocate who would run through a wall if she thought she could help a victim stay safe. She will help you, and we will help you figure it out. So we'll offer case management. If we don't have the language that you speak, we will find somebody who will do that for you. And something that's changed since COVID is we, with the Department of Justice grant that we got, we had a women's support group. And by the way, we'll help male victims as well. But the group itself is a women's group. I'm not opposed to having a men's group, but I haven't had enough men reach out to me, so they'll have to go down to Dave Cohen's group at ADV. But we now run every Friday at 1 o'clock. We have a survivor support group. It's really about self-care because some of our survivors are still living with abusers. Some of them have teenage children that have grown up and introjected the abuser's personalities, and they're being abused by their own teen kids. And so this is an hour a week where we sit together as women and we process that. So our website is womensrights.org. It's so simple, www.womensrights.org. If you go on that, there's a women's support group link. The only thing that we ask is that you register in advance so that we have some accountability to who's joining our group. We don't want it to be an open Zoom meeting where anybody can just show up. We would love to see you there. And it's open-ended. So it's not like you have to commit to come to 10 groups. If you show up, we're there to support you. If you don't show up, that's okay. And the reason why that's important is all of us, 100% of us, were so isolated during this period. Victims are victims of domestic violence in particular are even further isolated. So this group I believe it has been a lifesaver. So if you need something more than just that support group, which most people do, I'm going to encourage you to call us because we have a case manager who will take you to court, who will fill out the restraining orders for you, will fill out the victim's crime compensation applications, will recommend that you go to one of these agencies or one of these lawyers to get the extra services that you need. And of course, I'm just going to say it, our number is 201-568-1166. If no one answers, leave us a message. Someone will get back to you. I also want to tell you on our website, womensrights.org, if you hit contact us, there'll be a page there where you can confidentially send me, and I'm the only one who gets it, an email that says what you're looking for. So if you're a victim, survivor, or someone who's just not sure, send me an email and I will definitely get a staff to respond to you. I have a lot more to say, as you can tell. I love microphones. So did I cover enough, Matthew?
Yes, you did, Lil. I'll come back to you then again later. Don't worry. By the way, to those who are watching and viewing at home, thank you. This symposium is not just intended for survivors of domestic violence. It's also intended for family members and friends of victims. Perhaps you're watching and you're trying to get information to help a friend or loved one. Thank you for tuning in. This symposium is also, as Mr. Cohen spoke about earlier, intended to speak to the offenders who want to get help, who want to get better, who want to stop abusing. Ultimately, everyone on this panel shares a love and a passion for saving families. I'm humbled to be a part of this. So this question is posed by, well, it was asked to me. I don't know if it wasn't formally presented, but I'm going to ask by Alyssa Lunam, who is the chair of the New Milford Municipal Alliance. The New Milford Municipal Alliance does a fantastic job of tackling very difficult issues regarding addiction and drunk driving and the opioid epidemic, which are also crises facing our society. And I was asked, what is the relationship between drinking, drug use, and domestic violence? Ms. Gomperts.
Hi. Hi. I know you asked about the relationship, but I'm going to answer about the correlation, and it is high. And in fact, we were talking about this before the formal panel started about why do we think, we were all sort of hypothesizing about why we think that the instances of domestic violence have risen so sharply during the pandemic. And there are, of course, the obvious ones, which is people are locked in the home for the most part with an abuser or somebody who was not an abuser before but has become an abuser. And people are scared about the virus. People are suffering from food insecurity, job insecurity. The children are not in school, and everybody is using alcohol or drugs to cope. And it is in the best of situations, it is a deadly combination: intoxication, addiction, mental illness, and domestic violence. And it has all just been writ so much larger by this pandemic, which is forcing everybody to be in a home, in a situation that is just rife with the possibilities for trauma. And then you just add in people using a lot more coping mechanisms, which most times are drugs, alcohol. And it's really been, I've seen the instances of people who are, when the police respond and the defendants are arrested, the instances of intoxication, severe intoxication, either from alcohol or drugs, especially during this time period, has really skyrocketed.
Thank you. Maria.
Just to sleep, just to be able to sleep, and that's very real, and it was something that I have to recognize and get help for. But this is something that happens on the victim side as well, and that's why I want to encourage them, whether you're a family member that knows someone or you're the person that's experiencing that trauma yourself, and you may not be thinking it as trauma, but you are noticing you're drinking more or using things that are self-sabotaging, that aren't healthy, in order to cope with what you're dealing with whatever kind of abuse you're experiencing, that there are resources out there to help you so that you do not continue on that downward spiral, and that you can not just gain health and safety for you and your family, but just mental health and emotional health and safety for yourself.
Thank you, Maria. And while you're speaking, I'm going to ask you this question. As a survivor of domestic violence yourself, and as an advocate, you've become an inspiration to other survivors around the state and elsewhere. What advice can you offer them if they're survivors that you wish you knew when you were going through the abusive situation that you were in?
I wouldn't say I wish I knew. I would say, one, when I first was experiencing intimate partner violence, I internalized it and blamed myself. And I would tell you that it's not your fault. That there's nothing that you're doing to deserve being to be in an abusive situation. It isn't your fault. And there's also, you shouldn't be ashamed. I was ashamed to talk about what was happening. I, again, internalized it, thought it was my fault. I think that we have this stereotype of who is abused. And it happens to everyone, all walks of life. And sometimes that shame is a huge barrier. As you can see with this panel, and this just, while this is Bergen County focused, there are organizations like this throughout the state. Seem to keep having my trouble. There are organizations like this throughout the state that provide help, safety, and resources. I spoke about Forever Your Overwatch Foundation, FYOfoundation.org, as other people have spoken about their organizations. There are resources. There are so many resources out there that can help you get out of an abusive situation, whether that's gaining financial independence, the mental health aspect. If you have a child or children and you're afraid because you don't want to lose your children, there are so many people out there that can help you. And again, it is not your fault. The resources are there. And especially with the LGBTQ community, we haven't really talked with that community. And there are barriers, special barriers to them, because maybe they're not out to their families and they're afraid to go to their families. They experience intimate partner violence at the same to even higher rates. More studies are showing. So even then, there are organizations specific to you and that you shouldn't feel ashamed. Again, no one should feel ashamed. It is not your fault. And that would be the biggest thing that I would relay, because oftentimes that is the barrier. There are resources, and there are resources to also help you feel safe in leaving.
Thank you, Maria. And since we're on the topic of discussing the correlations between these societal crises, Ms. Sadek, I'm going to ask you this question as a sexual violence advocate. What, if any, is the correlation between substance abuse and sexual violence?
So we can go around and around with this, but research has also shown that while, yes, if you incorporate drugs and alcohol, there is drug-facilitated sexual assault, but oftentimes sexual assault is and domestic violence and these crimes of power and control are oftentimes because of rigid gender socialization, right? You're taught to behave a certain way. You're taught to hate. This is part of your peer culture. That's, we live in a society that's fueled by rape culture. Rape supportive myths are running rampant. So while drugs and alcohol are used to facilitate sexual assault, I think also we're not looking at how folks are socialized to accept these behaviors. We talked about toxic masculinity earlier. Dave Cohen mentioned it. That's also a part of sexual assault as well. So I think it's important, while it's used to facilitate the sexual assault, it's also a bigger portion of it is our socialization.
Thank you. Mr. Cohen, just to follow up on Ms. Sadek's, on her point, in your work trying to provide treatment to offenders of domestic violence, how do you overcome or help the offenders overcome their need for power and control to help them get better?
Well, the first thing is to recognize that they are in fact caught up. The first thing is to make sure that we get across. That's why the education piece is so important, because most of our offenders, when they get in trouble, when they get arrested, many of them are literally shocked that they're getting in trouble for doing something that, hey, my dad did it, he never got in trouble. Grandpa used to do it, he never got in trouble. So these concepts of power and control, domestic violence, they're very foreign As I mentioned earlier, abuse is learned behavior. If a child is growing up in a domestic violence home, it's not like the little boy is looking at his parents going, oh my God, they're involved in domestic violence. They don't have a word for it. It's just the way it is. So we try to teach the men that it's not just the way it is. It most definitely was that way in their home, but there are alternatives. There are other ways to perceive relationships, to perceive women, to perceive ourselves as men. And that's really where the education piece comes in. Just giving people, calling it what it is, figuring out how it started, and what we can do to change it.
Thank you, David. Simaza?
If I can just add, 30 years ago, domestic violence didn't have a name. It was called life, right? A problem with no name. And Betty Friedan's book, A Feminine Mystique, really kind of brought this out in the light during the second wave of the feminist movement. So it's interesting to hear Dave talk about that, right? It was a problem with no name. Now we're defining it. Education is important. Knowing how to define these crimes that are happening to folks, I think, is important too.
Thank you, Simaza. Commissioner Ortiz, you spoke earlier tonight about how cultural differences impact domestic violence. Commissioner, to what extent do cultural differences more specifically impact the need for power and control that Ms. Sadek and Mr. Cohen have spoken about tonight?
I think we all touched on the different aspects of that, and it's all a matter of just control, and most of all, just having the control of their loved one, or they think that's their way of showing love, and I think that's just something that has to be education, as we all spoke. And unfortunately, we're also, what I'm seeing, which I didn't mention earlier, it's the political fear that we're seeing with what was going on with ICE and throughout the country. That shouldn't be a reason to hold you back. It doesn't make it okay to stay in a relationship because you don't have the documents to stay here. There's a lot of help. Nobody's asking them for the documents. I stress this over and over with all the phone calls. It's a matter of just getting help, and loss of children, and just basically making them like they're not worthy just because they're not legal is just not right. So that's just one aspect of it. I think it's education. Like we said, like I mentioned earlier, it's a generational culture. It's not okay to be machista. It does not make you cool amongst your peers. That is just not acceptable. And you're seeing that, I guess, as the generations goes on. And sometimes you don't. I have a daughter in college. She unfortunately sees it all the time. They drink or they go out to a party, and the next thing you know, they're getting abused, but it's okay because they feel like it's their fault. I shouldn't have drank. I shouldn't have worn this outfit. I mean, it's all about education and just really getting that message out and really relating it to your own children that it's not okay, and your sons and your daughters and so on and so forth. So it's something that's has to be learned. And just events like today, just having the awareness, and so people have an understanding of it, and having young teachers. That's why it's so important to get the education out at an early age at high schools, like what we do through ADV and through amongst everybody here that we partner with. It is just truly important to get them. It's not okay. We need to respect each other in any relationship. And I'm glad that, like I said, we are fortunate enough to have a department within our county that we are able to do this, and with our partnerships. And I'm glad that you brought up the LGBT community, because I feel like that's an area that we really have to start focusing on as well. Thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you, Commissioner. Sergeant Herrero, many times when somebody calls 911, they have no idea what to expect. Probably most of the time, they don't know what to expect. Could you please speak to the process from the law enforcement point of view? Walk us through, from the moment of the 911 call, what happens so survivors know.
Well, you call 911, and of course, you're going to elicit a police response. And then when we arrive on scene, what we're going to do is we're going to speak to all parties involved. there are certain aspects of domestic violence that require the accused to be arrested. And somebody had pointed out before that when we say domestic violence, a lot of times just people focus on the second word there, violence. And they don't understand that when they're being harassed, that falls under domestic violence. You know, so if somebody's driving by a former, somebody you were involved with is driving by your block 100 times a day, you know, well, I'm not being physically assaulted. No, you're not, but you're being harassed. So, you know, I like the fact that that was cleared up before, because we get caught up on the second part of the term, which is the violence part. So we arrive on scene and we speak to the parties involved. And if it falls under the mandatory arrest part of domestic violence, well, then we're going to arrest the accused. It's mandatory. There is no gray area. We can't walk away. Well, what's a mandatory arrest? A mandatory arrest is I see an injury on the person, on the victim. The victim complains and says that they were hurt during the altercation. There's no bruise, there's no cut, but you hurt yourself when you were pushed down to the floor. That's a mandatory arrest. So we're going to arrest the accused at that point. But that shouldn't in any way dissuade anybody from calling the police, because as also somebody mentioned that judges are going to take care of you when presented with, they're not going to take away money so you can get food. Okay, if the abuser is taken out of the home, or you're still going to get your child support. You're still going to be supported by the courts. You're still going to be supported by the prosecutor's office. So a lot of times you would think that people won't call 911 because they're afraid of that. So when you call 911, obviously police are going to respond. It's going to happen. And then we're going to, again, attack down on a case-to-case basis. But just for full disclosure, there are points in there where there are mandatory arrests. There are also discretionary arrests. So, and there's also follow-ups to make sure that, you know, that person, listen, I wish that we could stop domestic violence right here and now with the symposium. And I wish that so many times that I've gone on calls and spoken to victims that they would have, you know, heeded, you know, the words that were shared between myself and them. But, you know, it's not a perfect world. So as long as people call 911, rest assured that the police will be responding to that call and handling it appropriately.
Ms. Gomperts, would you like to add to that?
Well, I'm glad the sergeant brought up the focus when we talk about domestic violence on the violence aspect. There are all sorts of crimes that do not involve necessarily the physical violence that we think about, the assaults, that fall underneath the protections of the Domestic Violence Act. Sergeant Herrero mentioned harassment. Another one is stalking, where a person commits the crime of stalking if that person is engaging in a course of conduct directed at you with the purpose to either put you in fear for yourself, a third party, which would include a child, a family member, pets are protected under the Prevention of Domestic Violence Act, or to cause you to suffer other emotional distress. So if that ex-boyfriend is driving past your house 100 times a day, if they are calling your office repeatedly, calling your friends, commenting on your social media posts, or engaging in any other course of conduct where their intention is to make you fear for your safety or suffer other emotional distress, which is very broadly defined by the courts, that is also domestic violence. And like Lil said before, you may not think that you're a victim because you are not getting punched in the face or hit with a weapon, but you are still very much considered a victim under the laws of New Jersey, and therefore you're entitled to the protections of the police, of the courts, of the prosecutor's office. So just because there's no physical violence does not mean that you are not a victim as defined by the statute and are not going to receive help from any of the agencies that are present here.
Ms. Rodriguez-Gregg.
I have a question. Sorry.
Please.
I have a question. So when we're talking about the different forms of domestic violence, which I think is very good to highlight, what happens, and this is something that I've encountered in my advocacy of trying to help people escape domestic violence, but part of it has been harassment, stalking. And we talk about some places aren't a perfect world, right? Some counties and municipalities do it better than others. Some, and let's be realistic, some law enforcement are, some police are better trained than others. While there's supposed to be consistent training, some people may do it better than others. And what I mean by that is that there are areas where people have gone through the process that we're talking about. They've gone to, they have a restraining order. That person's violating the restraining order, whether it's utilizing social media to harass them, creating ghost accounts, driving by their home, and they may record this, they may show this and try and demonstrate it, and there's no consequences for that person that's violating the restraining order. Or, like I said, with law enforcement, if that abuser is someone who is in law enforcement. I had an experience where someone reached out. Their abuser was law enforcement. That person basically received desk duty, still had their firearm. They had desk duty for a couple of days, and then they were back. It seemed that there was no consequences, and that's something that is completely disheartening to a victim, and they feel that there's nothing else that they can do. What can they do? Because I have been told there are avenues. There are other things that they can do if they're in a situation where they're experiencing basically barriers where there's supposed to be help.
So, of course, I can't speak to what happens in other counties with other police departments. I do know that here in Bergen, we do a tremendous amount of training and education with our local law enforcement. And as Sergeant Herrero can comment on, I am crazy about it. We have mandatory training 4 times a year at a minimum. There are large amounts of continuing education with the police departments, and we here in Bergen County, at least, do make sure that there is consistency throughout the police departments in the handling of these crimes, because it's overseen by the prosecutor's office. It's overseen by, frankly, it's overseen by me. I see everything every arrest that happens, every police report that's written. But more specifically, if victims are finding barriers, there are other options. The law provides that if a victim goes to the police to report a crime and the police feel that they do not have probable cause to sign that criminal complaint, that they do not feel that there is enough evidence being presented to them by the victim always has the right to sign a civilian complaint. Always, no matter what that charge is for, no matter who that charge is against. And that complaint comes to the prosecutor's office for review to make sure that it is right, to make sure that the victim has chosen the correct statute to go along with the allegations that the victim is making. And then it is forwarded to the municipal court, and that victim has access to a municipal court judge. And in the case of domestic violence, it's usually within 24 hours, if not immediate, where a judge is then reviewing that complaint. So if victims are not finding satisfaction with the local police, they can file civilian complaints and find satisfaction with the municipal court judge. Victims who have restraining orders that they feel are being violated, or other court orders that they feel are not being adhered to, they can go directly to the family court and file motions to be heard I think they're called orders to show cause. I don't do civil law, but I think that's what they're called, right? Yes. They can file orders to, yes, they can file orders to show cause where they will be in front of a Superior Court judge who will hear what they have to say. And the process is not as daunting at all as it sounds. And I know that Carol said before, you wouldn't do brain surgery on yourself, and you should absolutely utilize the services of legal aid. But the New Jersey court system has a wonderful website, and there's an entire section on the website, which is njcourts.gov, about representing yourself in court. And it's a humongous resource for victims of all sorts of crimes, or all sorts of citizens who want access to the New Jersey courts, who feel that whatever other avenues they have followed have not given them satisfaction. But here in Bergen County, I hope and I think that we are better, but victims who are being turned away, there are many other places you can go. And you also can always call the prosecutor's office. You can always call the prosecutor's office. You'll get a victim witness advocate on the phone. You can come as a walk-in and walk into the prosecutor's office, and you will be able to speak to a detective there who will hear what's going on. So there are many other ways to have somebody hear your voice if you feel that you're not being heard.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, can I follow up with
Please.
that? I don't know if this is on, but I talk loudly anyway. And also, if you are a victim going through that, you should reach out to one of our agencies, Legal Aid, Center for Hope and Safety, Women's Right, ADV, and we can help guide you and possibly represent you through that order show cause process. Or we can also call Jessica, who's very, very responsive, and help you also receive relief through the police otherwise. I practiced in other counties before Bergen County, and I do say that Bergen County, we tend to be more responsive, and our officers are much better trained. And I'm not saying that just to suck up to you, Jessica, but it is true. They really are better trained, and we have very well-run avenues, so that even if you perhaps aren't getting the satisfaction you need from that police officer, I think we do have a good network that can support you and help you receive the services that you might need. So yeah, just reach out to any one of us, and we would try to help.
Don't put the mic away. I have a question for you. But before I ask you this question, I just want to mention to those watching at home, as we're nearing the end of our program, for those of you who are not aware, there's an email address that is posted on the New Milford Borough website at www.newmilfordborough, Borough is BORO.com. That email address is synced to my phone right here at this podium. Please, if you have a question for this panel, if you have a comment, email, it'll buzz my phone, and I'm checking for your comments as we have a symposium. So I just want everybody to be aware you can ask this panel questions even though you're at home. Ms. Miller has done a great job of talking about not only domestic violence, but services that Center for Hope and Safety provides. And she's very humble, so she's probably not going to like me for saying this. However, I had the true privilege, and I mean that sincerely, of working with you at Partners for Women in Justice in Essex County. So I personally witnessed the fantastic work that Ms. Miller has performed as an attorney representing low-income victims of domestic violence. So I'm going to ask you this question. What is domestic violence? We know that the list of predicate acts is quite lengthy. As Assistant Prosecutor and Chief Gomperts has discussed, it's more than just physical violence. Can you please educate those watching as to what is abuse and domestic violence?
Matt, I'm going to say that domestic violence is power and control, but I am going to ask if Lil Corcoran can answer this question. And I'm not saying that to be humble, but because she does provide a beautiful training on domestic violence. So.
Well, Kate, I'm so happy that you said that, because I was just about to text Matt, and I'm saying, oh, ask me that question, ask me that question. So I love that you know me that well. So, you know, I just want to say that I was a college professor. I love to talk. I did a 40-hour training on domestic violence and would run out of time. So to answer this question in a minute is almost impossible for me, but I'm going to tell you that, so I got to just say this too, because I heard people talking about mental health, which is, of course, there's a correlation between mental health and substance abuse, but they don't cause domestic violence, right? Because there's many batterers that go to AA and get sober and still continue to abuse. There's many non-alcoholics who abuse their partners. It's a correlation, but it's not a cause and effect. And also, domestic violence, in my opinion, and there's lots of research to back it, is not a mental health issue, right? Because there's lots of folks, I'll tell you how you know it's not a mental health issue. If I'm a perpetrator and I'm abusing my family, and I come out and I'm in a symposium like this and you piss me off, am I gonna hit you? Not with all these cops here and everything anyway, right? Not with the prosecutor here. That would be insane. So if I was mentally ill and if I had it in me to be an abusive person and was mentally ill, I probably wouldn't be able to discriminate between my family and the panel of folks that are sitting in this room. How come the abuser, who supposedly, and I say with air quotes, mentally ill, isn't beating everybody else up? Now, there may be a mentally ill person that's beating other people up too, but then that's another issue, right? But that mentally ill, that person that's using that as an excuse to abuse their family is usually not going to work and punching out their boss, right? I worked for ADV too. Again, I said I'm old. I hired Kate too, so I'm just going to throw it all out there. I've done it all. So, I used to, when I worked for ADV and I did intakes with batterers, and I'd say, it would come up like why they were hitting their wives or abusing their wives. Well, anyway, I just lost my train of thought. I told you I was old. So let me go back to what I'm going to give you I promised you a short answer, and then I gave you a long one. I believe it's not possible to be a human being and not have been abused. If you're on this planet, you've been abused at some point, because abuse is about dominance, power, and control. If you were picked on as a kid, if you've been subjected to racism, I'm going to give you the very long continuum of what abuse is. It's being on someone trying to put their thumb over you, right, to control you. And that can start from all the way at this end, which is relatively benign, of someone telling you to shut up. Who are you to tell someone to shut up, right? Telling you don't speak. To the other end of the continuum, which is homicide. And if you think about that very, very long continuum, there's a lot of stuff in between. And it's almost not possible to have been a human being and not have fallen on that continuum somewhere. I also believe that we're on that continuum as perpetrators, right? And hopefully we're all at this end of the continuum and moving in that direction, right? And it's when you start to move up the continuum that things get serious and you end up in someone like the prosecutor's office or the police department or in front of Judge Siegal, right? So abuse can start off, and also I just want to say this too, abuse is not, so when you say what is domestic violence, there's two questions. One is what's the legal definition of domestic violence, which could be very different than what I've just described to you, which is the sociological definition of domestic violence. It's when we say power and control, we mean someone's trying to dominate you and using every control tactic in the book to make that happen. And guess what? If I smacked you and you're still not compliant, then maybe I'll be nice to you and buy you flowers, and maybe that'll get you to do what I want you to do. So even that can be used as part of the controlling cycle when we talk about the honeymoon. See, I told you, it was a 40-hour course. Jessica, you should have me come up and help train, because I could just then talk all day long. I probably went off on way too many directions there, but I have a lot to say about that. So call me. Call me. I gave you the number, womensrights.org. Let's get in touch. And by the way, I just got to say this, Matthew, because New Milford was always a leader on this issue. So thank you for hosting this. We were, years ago when we had crisis response teams, domestic violence response teams, there were 3 towns that got involved early on. It was New Milford, Teaneck, and Leonia. They were the very first 3 towns in Bergen County that jumped on board with the idea of having a crisis response team, so that when victims came to the police department, they would have an advocate like me or someone else come in and speak with them. I hope you're still doing it. So thank you for that, New Milford.
I just want to take a moment to give you some feedback, thanks to Councilwoman Lisa San Hughes, and some comments we're getting. New Milford and Bergen County are great at helping domestic violence victims. Every town, every city, every village needs a Jessica Gomperts. People are watching and saying thank you. Meanwhile, I do have a question specifically for you, Assistant Prosecutor Gomperts. The question reads, why do you think celebrities champion the cause of criminals and prison reform, but don't equally come out to support victims of crime?
Read it one more time.
Why do you think celebrities champion the cause of criminal and prison reform, but don't equally come out to support victims of crime?
So I think that it probably has to do with the fact that bail reform and criminal justice reform has, in the past couple of years, gained a tremendous amount of traction, because it's something that we desperately needed a national conversation about, was not having a national conversation about it. And finally, specific to New Jersey, on January 1st, 2017, the Criminal Justice Reform Act in New Jersey became law that reformed, not to get too into the weeds here, but that reformed the entire way the criminal justice system deals with the arrest and initial court handling of defendants. And I think that celebrities, by their nature, are interested in the cause celeb. I mean, that's what that expression means, right? And I think that it is sexy to rally around people that have been marginalized by the system, or that it's perceived that a group of people, because of their race or socioeconomics, have been marginalized by the system. That is sexy. Supporting victims who are still seen by society as weak and often the cause of their own problems. And I can tell you that as somebody who has tried many jury trials, that victims are still seen as the person at fault. And I think that especially in intimate partner violence and sexual violence, you hear the expression, oh, well, it's a he said, she said, or, well, maybe she shouldn't have said that. Maybe she shouldn't have done that. And it's a tactic that abusers use also. When you talk to victims, you hear that they've been told, well, I'm so sorry, look what you made me do. And so I think that for that reason, and to answer that oddly specific question, but that would be my hypotheses about what that's about, is that one is sexy and one is weak, or perceived as such.
Assemblywoman Swain, looking to the future with your work in the legislature, what would you like to see happen going forward to help victims and survivors?
Well, one of the things that I was thinking about just a few minutes ago, I think it was, Dave was, can you hear me?
Better.
Well, okay. I was thinking about one of the bills that I had put forward about campus sexual assault. And that was increasing the fines to schools of higher education for not properly reporting it, and also for not properly dealing with victims of sexual assault on campus. Because, many times somebody does the abusing and they get away with it. And then you have a victim who's not taken seriously and thinks that they're just not valued. And that kind of, you were talking about behavior, which is why I thought about my bills on campus sexual assault. I see, can you hear me okay? And how important it is that we address these behaviors early on. I mean, obviously, by the time they get to college, it's already too late, that we have to go earlier. But that's something that, listening to everyone who's talking, that we really need to address, is the education of people at a very early age. It's almost about, you remember we had that campaign about good touch, bad touch, so that we can, continue and people realize that their lives are worthwhile and that they should not be abused, and they can get out of those relationships, but they need the support of the institutions around them.
Ms. Dejackmo.
When we look at a victim and they're perceived as being weak, or to take blame. Victims are very strong, and they show their strength by working through the abuse that they're experiencing. And when we look at domestic violence, we talk about power and control, but that power and control is used to instill fear. And when someone's living in fear, you're not going to come out as powerful or forceful. When we look at relationships where there's mutual abuse and a female gets aggressive, generally research shows that they are at greater risk at being more severely harmed. So we really should take and reflect when we perceive that a victim is weak, because their abuser is using that power and control to instill fear. And most people, when they're in fear, are not going to come out as forceful.
So, Ms. Dejackmo, looking ahead, looking into the future, where would you like to see services in Bergen County go to help victims even more?
I'd like to see more with prevention, more starting with the youth, so that when someone is experiencing another person being jealous, that they can identify that that behavior is with jealousy and that it's not a sign of affection. When someone is using phrases where, if you love me, or if you would do that, and it works, that's an issue. So identifying behaviors at a young age, parents learning to have conversations with toddlers, identifying emotions where a boy learns all the spectrums of different emotions, from frustration and not to anger, or being annoyed and then frustrated and then getting angry, so that you learn from the beginning that that's not the only emotion that you can express. That's really where I would really like to see services going.
Ms. Weissman, speaking to those viewing the symposium tonight who are either at home feeling trapped and isolated themselves, or knowing somebody who is at home trapped and isolated, what advice would you have for them to get help?
I think the most important thing is to realize that there are all of these agencies here and all of us that are here to help you at this point in time, and that you're not alone. I think one of the most elemental things, and as Jessica was saying, is especially in these times of COVID, is the fact that everyone is feeling isolated, feeling trapped, that they have no resources. I think one of the pluses of COVID, if there can be any of that, are all of the virtual resources that are now available, that if you're out there, you don't have to physically walk out of your apartment. You can get online, call the women's organization, you can contact ADV, you can contact Healing Space, you can contact our offices for representation. We're at 201-487-2166. And secondly, to understand that you don't have to internalize what's going on, that it is important to reach out to friends, to family, that there is no shame, it is not your fault. And if that can be, one thing you learn from this, and to learn to reach out to get the help. I know for legal services, not only will we represent you, but we'll give advice about getting restraining orders or not. That's another factor. So clearly to realize that there are all these resources to help you. I can't tell you how many times clients have come in and said, I just never knew you guys were here, or the other services were here. I believe we're going to put on the website everybody's contact information. But I also wanted to address one other thing when we were talking about the fear and the abuse, and we've been talking about it in the context of the different violence act. It extends beyond that as well. It's economic, it's other factors that force people to have to stay together that can even go beyond the abuse when the abuse is occurring. So again, the plug there is all of us can help you to realize that there is economic relief, mental health relief, that you don't have to stay in these relationships because you think you're not going to be able to afford the rent or have an apartment or have a place to go. So if everybody can remember that, hopefully we've taught you something tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. So Judge Siegal, I opened with you, so it would only be appropriate if I closed with you. Same question. Talking to the viewers watching tonight's symposium, as a former Superior Court judge yourself who sat on the bench hearing case after case after case involving domestic violence, what advice do you have for somebody who feels trapped at home right now, who needs help?
This issue has resonated with me, I think, when I first became an attorney, and I worked on the board for Shelter Our Sisters, which was the predecessor for Center for Hope and Safety. It's such a overwhelming and problem. And when you talked and asked before, why doesn't it get the attention? I think it's because women who suffer or are the victims are ashamed, and it doesn't have the same support because we don't talk about it. Sometimes men are a lot more savvy when they present themselves in the courtroom situation, and if you've seen a victim of domestic violence, she's often traumatized and unable to communicate in the same way as her oppressor. But I can say, and why I'm so enthusiastic about being here again this year, is because we recognize the issue and because all of the people on this panel are representative of the groups from the beginning through the end of how we can help women and their families who are victims of domestic violence. So.
Thank you, Judge. I just want to share with you, I was just thinking the other day, I'm a bit of a kid at heart, and I grew up loving the Marvel comics, and Avengers came on, and it's truly humbling to share this stage, this symposium with all of you. You're all real heroes. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your hard work. Thank you for your passion. It's because of the work you all do and your passion that we're able to come together to help those in need. It's a true team effort. I could not do a symposium at all, particularly like this, without all of your help. You've helped me from the beginning. Thank you. I'd like to thank every agency here, every panelist here, and every speaker here. Thank you. I would also like to thank every organization who helped promote this event, who helped to spread word of this event on both sides of the aisle. This is a nonpartisan issue. I couldn't be prouder to have the support of so many people and agencies. I can't unfortunately thank every individual here, but I have special thanks for the New Milford Mayor and Council, for the New Milford Police Department, for the Bergen County Prosecutor's Office, to the Bergen County Sheriff's Department, and to the Bergen County Board of Education and Superintendent Michael Polizzi, who all co-partnered and co-sponsored this event together with us. So I just want to sincerely, from the bottom of my heart, say thank you to all of you. Anyone out there who shared a post on social media, who told someone about tonight's event, thank you. Thanks to Seton Hall Law School, and in particular, Dean Kathleen Buzang and Associate Clinical Professor Jessica Miles, who is not a panelist this evening, but who worked very hard behind the scenes to help to prepare this program and write questions to be presented tonight. Mayor Putrino, would you like to come up and say a few words?
Once again, we just wanted to say thank you for joining us tonight. This is such a talented panel. It's absolutely amazing. I've been watching some of the feedback on the live stream, and it's tremendous, absolutely tremendous. Once again, I have to thank Councilman Seymour for putting this together and getting all of you together. It's because of him that we're actually doing this, and I hope that this is something we continue. I hope it's something that the county can partner with us, and maybe we can make it bigger and make it countywide. It's that important. So once again, thank you for sharing your time and being in New Milford, New Jersey tonight. Thank you.
I'd like to call Assistant Prosecutor Jessica Gomperts down, please, for a moment.
It's just for everything you've done. I wanted to present you with the proclamation tonight.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you, Matt.
And she's humble as well, but Jessica Gomperts is our quarterback for this event. I'm actually especially appreciative that she can handle and deal with me being extra annoying as I prepare this event. So thank you, Jessica. And thank you, Prosecutor Masella, for your true support and for coming to every symposium we have. We know the county's in great hands with you running the prosecutor's office. Thank you. So with that, I'm going to say thank you to all of those watching. If any of you are a victim who needs help, call your local police department. If there's an emergency, call 911. The email address that we provided, if you email that address, we will be happy to provide you with contact information for any agency here or any panelist who spoke tonight. So please, if you're watching and there's anybody here that you want to speak to or an agency that you want to help you, please email that account and I will forward that email to the appropriate agency in the appropriate confidential matter. Thank you and good night.